On July 8, 1947, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, Lieutenant Walter Haut, issued an official press release. It is one of the most consequential documents in American media history, and you can read it right now because it is preserved in the National Archives. The press release stated, in plain language, that the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic bomb unit on the planet at that time, had recovered a crashed flying disc on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. Not a balloon. Not debris. A flying disc. The release was approved by the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, and transmitted by wire services to newspapers across the country within hours. The Roswell Daily Record ran the headline that afternoon, "RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." This is not a theory. This is not a rumor. This is the documented, verified, primary source first official statement from the United States military about what they recovered. The most secretive military installation in the country, home to the only nuclear strike force in existence, told the press they had a flying saucer. But that is not the story you have heard. Because less than 24 hours later, a second press conference happened, and the story changed completely. General Roger Ramey, commanding officer at the regional headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, stood in front of photographers with debris spread across his office floor and announced that the object was, in fact, a weather balloon with a radar reflector. Same military. Same week. Same event. From flying disc to weather balloon in less than a day, that is the official record. Two contradictory statements from two different commanding officers within 24 hours of each other. And for 47 years, the weather balloon story remained the official explanation. Until it changed again. So here is the question that should make you uncomfortable. If it really was a weather balloon, why did it take the United States Air Force 3 more attempts, over 5 more decades, to explain what actually happened? And why does each new official explanation require walking back claims made in the previous official explanation? I am not going to give you the easy version of this story. I am not going to tell you it was aliens. I am also not going to tell you it was definitely a balloon. What I am going to do is show you document by document exactly what the United States government has officially said about Roswell since 1947, and let you sit with the fact that no government agency in the world changes its official explanation of the same event 4 times across 50 years, unless something about the first 3 explanations did not hold up under scrutiny. There is a documented pattern in government communications research called explanation drift, when an institution's official account of a single event changes multiple times in response to external pressure rather than new evidence. It is studied formally in fields like public administration and crisis communications. The pattern is not exclusive to UFO cases. It shows up in corporate scandals, in military incidents, in political crises. What makes Roswell academically interesting to researchers in this field is the sheer duration and the sheer number of iterations. Most explanation drift cases resolve within months or a few years. Roswell's official explanation has been actively revised by the United States government across 5 decades, with the most recent major revision occurring not in the 1940s, not in the 1950s, but in 1997, 50 years after the event. That is a fact. Verifiable. With document numbers. What it means about the underlying event is a separate question, and one I am going to keep distinct from the fact itself throughout this investigation. Now here is the detail that should not exist. In 1994, responding to a formal congressional inquiry from New Mexico Representative Stephen Schiff, who had grown frustrated trying to get a straight answer through normal channels, the United States Air Force commissioned the General Accounting Office to investigate what had actually happened at Roswell in 1947. The resulting 1995 GAO report made an extraordinary discovery. The original records from Roswell Army Airfield covering the period of the incident, including outgoing messages from that exact time frame, were missing. Not classified, not redacted, missing. The GAO report states explicitly that administrative records covering the period in question had been destroyed, and that no explanation for the specific authorization or date of destruction could be located. The military's own oversight investigation could not find the paperwork explaining what happened to its own paperwork about Roswell. Wait. The same year that a sitting congressman forces an official investigation into a 50-year-old weather balloon story, the supporting documents from that exact period turn out to be missing, with no record of who destroyed them or why. That is in the GAO's own published findings. You can request the report yourself. I kept pulling on this thread, and what happened next made the story even harder to dismiss as a simple case of bureaucratic confusion. In 1994, The same year as the GAO inquiry, the Air Force published its own internal report, titled the Roswell Report: Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. This report offered a new explanation, different from the 1947 weather balloon claim. According to this 1994 report, the debris recovered in 1947 actually came from Project Mogul, a classified Cold War program using high-altitude balloons with radar equipment to detect Soviet nuclear tests, a program so secret in 1947 that even the base commander who approved the original flying disc press release may not have been read into its existence. This explains the weather balloon language used in 1947. It was not entirely false, it was a cover story for an actually classified but mundane balloon project. That is explanation number 3, but this report did not address everything. Specifically, it did not address persistent witness claims about recovered bodies. So 3 years later, in 1997, the Air Force published a second follow-up report, the Roswell Report. Case closed. This report proposed that witness memories of bodies were the result of a phenomenon the report called event conflation, where witnesses, over decades, mentally merged memories of the 1947 Roswell incident with memories of separate later military programs involving anthropomorphic test dummies dropped from high altitude during the 1950s, and a 1956 KC-97 aircraft crash that killed 11 airmen near Roswell. Different events, different decades, allegedly merged in witness memory into one story. Let me be precise about what is fact, what is hypothesis, and what is speculation, because that precision matters more in this story than almost any other. Facts. Lieutenant Walter Haut's July 8, 1947 press release used the words flying disc and was approved by the base commander. This document is in the National Archives. General Ramey's press conference the next day presented weather balloon debris, also documented and photographed. The 1995 GAO report confirmed that administrative records from Roswell Army Airfield covering the relevant time period are missing with no documented explanation for their destruction. The Air Force published 2 separate official reports in 1994 and 1997 offering different and additional explanations beyond the original 1947 weather balloon claim. Hypotheses supported by circumstantial evidence that the original 1947 weather balloon explanation was a deliberate cover story for the classified Project Mogul program, which the Air Force itself now claims. That the missing records identified by the GAO were destroyed in connection with Cold War classification protocols rather than something related to extraterrestrial material, given the documented existence of Project Mogul. Speculation without solid factual basis. That the debris recovered in 1947 was of extraterrestrial origin, or that recovered bodies of non-human origin were involved. I do not have verifiable evidence to support either of those specific claims, and will not present them as fact. Now think about what this sequence actually means. In 1947, flying disc. Then, within 24 hours, weather balloon. For 47 years, official silence, with weather balloon as the unchallenged explanation. In 1994, after congressional pressure, it was actually a classified balloon program called Project Mogul, and the original 1947 statement was a deliberate cover story authorized at some level of the military command structure. In 1997, the witness testimony about bodies, which the Air Force had never addressed in any of the prior 3 explanations, was reframed as memory conflation with unrelated later incidents. 4 official explanations, across 50 years, each one responding specifically to outside pressure. Journalists in 1947, a sitting member of Congress in 1994, persistent witness testimony that the 1994 report failed to address by 1997. This is not how an institution behaves when it has nothing to explain. This is how an institution behaves when each previous explanation generates follow-up questions serious enough that silence is no longer a viable strategy. I know what you might be thinking right now. Project Mogul is real. It is documented. It explains the original cover story logically. The military genuinely did not want to admit they were testing nuclear detection balloons during an active Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union, so weather balloon was a reasonable low-stakes lie to protect a real secret. That is a coherent, evidence-supported explanation, and I am not asking you to dismiss it. Here is what it does not fully resolve. If Project Mogul explains the cover story, it does not explain why administrative records from that specific period were destroyed with no documentation, according to the government's own oversight investigation. Classified programs get classified, not erased without record. There is a difference between information being restricted and information being destroyed without an audit trail. The GIO report identifies the second situation, not the first. That distinction has never been fully addressed by any of the 4 official Roswell explanations. But there is a question that almost nobody is asking with the seriousness it deserves. And this question reframes everything you have heard so far. The question is not, was it aliens or was it a balloon? That framing, the one that dominates almost all popular discussion of Roswell, forces you into a binary that the documented evidence does not actually support. The question that matters is this: why does an institution need 4 sequential, mutually adjusting cover stories across 5 decades to explain a single weather balloon? A genuine, simple weather balloon accident requires one explanation, given once, that holds up over time. The fact that the official explanation has needed structural revision 3 separate times, each time in direct response to external pressure rather than new physical evidence being discovered, tells you something about the event that is independent of whether anything extraterrestrial was involved. It tells you that whatever happened at Roswell in July 1947 was significant enough, classified enough, or sensitive enough that the institution responsible for explaining it has never been able to close the case with a single, stable, internally consistent account. In 2022, declassified Cold War-era documents related to Project Mogul's broader program history, released through continuing eFOIA requests, confirmed additional operational details about the balloon trains used in 1947, including their typical crash debris patterns and recovery protocols. These documents, reviewed by historians at the National Security Archive, are broadly consistent with the Air Force's 1994 Project Mogul explanation for the physical debris. This is a real piece of evidence that supports one part of the official current explanation. I want to be clear about that, because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging evidence that supports the mundane explanation, not only evidence that complicates it. What these 2022 documents do not address, and what no declassified document to date has addressed, is the missing administrative record identified by the GAO in 1995, or why witness testimony about the recovery operation itself, separate from the debris analysis, has remained a point of unresolved tension across all 4 official versions of events. And then I understood. The most interesting fact about Roswell is not what crashed. It is that the United States government has never been able to stop explaining it. So what do you do with this? First, when evaluating any institutional account of a historical event, count the number of times the official explanation has changed and ask what triggered each change. A stable truth does not need sequential revision. An incomplete truth often does. Second, distinguish between classification and destruction. A government withholding information through legitimate classification protocols is categorically different from a government missing its own administrative paper trail with no documented authorization for that absence. The GIO report establishes the second condition at Roswell, and that fact stands on its own, regardless of what you believe about the underlying event. Third, real declassified evidence, like the Project Mogul documentation, deserves to be weighted on its own merits. It explains part of the story. Acknowledging that an official explanation is partially correct does not require accepting that it is completely correct, and good investigation requires holding both of those positions simultaneously. Fourth, when a single event generates 4 official explanations across 50 years, the right response is not to pick your favorite one. It is to ask what specifically required each subsequent revision, because that pattern of required revision is itself the most reliable evidence available, regardless of which explanation eventually proves most accurate. So if Roswell was a balloon, why did the Army change the story 3 times? The honest answer, built entirely from documents you can request and verify yourself, is this. Because the first version, told within hours of the event by the base commander himself, used the words flying disc and was retracted by a different commanding officer less than a day later. Because the second version, weather balloon, held publicly for 47 years, was only formally revised after a sitting member of Congress forced a federal oversight investigation. Because that oversight investigation discovered the military's own records from the relevant period were missing, with no documentation explaining their destruction. Because the third version, Project Mogul, explained the debris but left witness testimony about a larger recovery operation completely unaddressed. And because the fourth version, published in 1997, attempted to resolve that remaining testimony through a memory conflation theory that even some Air Force historians have since described as the report's weakest section. 4 explanations. 50 years. Missing records with no audit trail. That is not a closed case. That is an institution that has spent half a century trying to make a single story hold together and has not yet succeeded. The question that will stay with you after this video ends is the one the GIO report itself never answered. If the records were destroyed in connection with a legitimate classified program, where is the documentation authorizing that destruction? And if no such documentation exists, what exactly was being protected that required leaving no trace at all?